Thank you very much for the introduction. It's nice to be among friends and colleagues. I'm about halfway through this book project, 6 chapters out of 12 at this point, and I really appreciate the opportunity to lay out its rationale and theoretical structure and get some feedback from this audience. The problem I'm wrestling with is what Ross Dunn and Pat Manning, who are world historians, term the middle levels of history. I would leave them on for the moment, if you would, and then we'll drop them later. Thank you. That is, between at the top, very broad characterizations of, say, a whole period, like the age of classical empires. Between that and at the bottom, specific studies of, say, a family or a legal system in a particular city, or in my case, the administration system of a particular kingdom. So I'm looking at what's in the middle between very specific studies that many of us do and very broad theoretical or large-scale generalizations that we're all very nervous about. Okay. First point is that I think grand narratives of national histories don't work very well as this middle-level history. When we read back the nation state and rather lay it over an empire of the past, a kingdom of the past, it really violates the lived lives of the people at the time, as well as isolates civilizations from each other. So then the first point is that grand narratives don't work very well in connected history. The second, which of course is close to our heart, is that area studies also don't work terribly well for this middle level of history. Very often, the things that happen at this level spill right over what we've arbitrarily decided are going to be areas. And I think the field quite well recognizes this. The border crossing panels at Association for Asian Studies is an example of trying to deal with the problem. Several years ago, in this exact venue, I was very hopeful that social network theory was going to be my engine for dealing with this middle level of history. The idea was to map human networks, mathematically work on the shape and structure and relations of the elements of those maps, and scale them up and down as necessary to deal with this middle level of history. Now, we could get some lights now. And this was one that I did. This is 12th century Jewish pepper traders working the southwest coast of India through Aden to Cairo. And actually, it worked pretty well for analyzing that set of relationships. But 5 years later, and a book later, which is this one, which was When Asia Was the World, I'm here to tell you that social network theory has great ideas, but the methodology is incredibly difficult to put into practice for most historical problems. You need a density and a precision of data that's rare in pre-modern history. It's even rare in history of 100 years ago. For example, in this map, which I'm not going to spend any time analyzing, I have no idea what communications are not there because all I have is the letters that still exist. And it's a category which is extremely fuzzy around the edges. The second problem, which we also discussed in this venue those years ago, was if you connect a social network like this, it doesn't tell us anything about the relationships between people. That is, are these relationships of trust, of suspicion, of friendship, of obligation, of honorable actions or dishonorable actions? We don't know. And social network theory as a field is, in fact, at the current moment, cutting edge, wrestling with exactly this kind of situation. They're trying to set up networks of trust, networks of family relationships. They're also dealing with networks over space, which I was trying to do. So the fact is I'm shifting away from social network theory. For the current book, which is called Roots and contracted to University of California Press, I'm using these roots as a middle-level analysis that I hope is going to avoid the traps of reifying a civilization and also reflect the lived lives of people at the time. This effort engages several theoretical debates. In history, I hope to move forward the debate on how people interact beyond what we would now call their comfort zone with terms like hybridity and creolization. I hope to move that entire debate forward. I wanted to get into the discussion over the control of roots by pre-modern governments. I'm also intending the book to affect social network theory. Two of the hottest debates right now are how to deal with location as a factor in social networks. It's being theorized in 5 or 6 places, including Italy and California, and also a heavy amount of work on the issue of trust within social networks. And I hope this also impacts that. In anthropology, which probably is more familiar, there's the continuing, possibly endless debate over culture. How contingent is it? What are the relations of culture to power? How is it contested? Specifically, the relation of culture to place. And this research particularly addresses the culture created jointly by people who are moving rather than fixed to a particular place. The book will analyze a dozen roots, and let me just run them off to you quickly. This is the land and maritime route of what we call this part of the Silk Road, but I'm treating them as a unified entity. This is the route around Africa of the Portuguese, of discovery. This is the East African slave trade to Baghdad and on to India. This is the Hajj, starting in Cairo and Baghdad, arriving at Mecca. This is the Nile River as a route. Up at the top there in blue is the pilgrimage to Compostela. And this, the red, is the water and maritime route from Rome to the eastern part of the empire. The Appian Way, the Ignatian Way, and the maritime route to Cairo. Well, at that time, not Cairo. Okay. Why these and not a dozen different routes? I wanted routes with a dense, embedded culture, not just the transport of a single commodity. For example, I'm not doing the route of the fishermen to the cod fisheries to catch fish and take it back. I want something much more dense than that. I want a wide geographic spread and a long historic frame. I wanted routes about which enough have been written so that I could pose a variety of common questions. I wanted longer routes, say at least 500 miles, so they crossed regions and jurisdictions and required institutions for travelers. And I wanted routes that were famous in their own time. And lastly, I needed to find a memoir of someone who traveled on the route and wrote about it. Since I've been doing all this talking about a route, what do I mean? I do not, right at the outset, mean a trade route. Trade and commodities are not privileged activities in my view of a route. Much more than trade moved along these routes. They were conduits for ideas, both written and oral, religions, art, technological innovation, magic, cuisine. On them traveled slaves, brides, pilgrims. The history of the route includes the people at both ends, as well as those who kept the way stations, the soldiers who guarded them, and the pirates and brigands who attacked them. Routes also have stretched human networks, legal and illegal, moral and immoral. These include credit, trust, information, and they often spanned continents. The research so far suggests that a route, as opposed to, say, a road, is a very complex layering of natural and ecological features, institutional features, mental expectations, material flows, and networks. Let me pose these as a series of questions, which I have and will ask of each route. Natural or ecological features. What were the spatial parameters of the route? How did it look? Did it hug river valleys? Did it follow the tops of mountains? Did it follow the contours of hills? How did routes cross rivers? Were there islands or oases crucial for water or food? Was there planning in development of the route, or was the process merely trial and error by travelers? What were the ecological constraints of a route that enforced a yearly rhythm? What season was the route open? What season closed? What was the yearly pattern of risk? These sorts of temporal patterns on a route are true of every one, whether it's the hurricane season in the Caribbean, the monsoon season in Southeast Asia, winter along the Silk Road, or, more pleasantly, April for Canterbury Tales. Institutional forms. How much direct protection did government provide? How much taxation and control did it exact? How essential was the route to the government? That is, for example, how much was the route restricted to government, military, and officials? And we start to visualize a whole range of answers to this. For example, if you think of the spice route from Southeast Asia to the Middle East, there's very little overt government control other than port cities. Contrast that with, say, the Inca route. Let me give you what I'm also going to do. Sorry. Well, I'm not getting it. There we go. It's a little slow. Let me give it a little longer, and I'll carry on, and then I'll come back to this. Okay. These are two of the routes I'm going to do in North America. One is the Mississippi River, clearly, and this one is El Camino Real. Tied all the missions together up from Baja California into our California in the United States in the 18th and 19th century. Okay, who maintained the rest houses, the warehouses, the caravanserais, the ports in port cities? What were the non-government institutions along the way? Did they have a larger vision or goal? Did the routes routinely stop? Did people on these routes stop and donate at worship and shrines along the way? Think about Sufi shrines, Sufi houses, Buddhist and Christian monasteries. Did these institutions favor certain groups or make it impossible for others to travel? Probably the most intriguing for me are mental expectations. Was there a common ethos among travelers on the route? Did travelers look similar? Pops right to mind. Think of going on the Hajj, where you change clothes, or the pilgrimage to Compostela. There were standard ways that people dressed. Did they buy equipment of a standard type or in a known bazaar serving the route? Certainly, again, true of the Hajj. that there was a standard bazaar in Cairo where everyone going on the Hajj bought their equipment. Same with Victorian travelers. Very often they bought their equipment in the same stores in London. Was there only one goal to the route, such as pilgrimage, or a whole variety of goals for different travelers? Did travelers expect a look to the route, such as mile markers, signage, road construction? And what sort of information passed between travelers? Was there a common language for the route? What about shared stories, songs, boasts, jokes? Were there professional entertainers along the route? How were stereotypes established and reinforced? What were the acceptable currencies? How did travelers know them and get them? Number 4, the material flows. Was there a dominant commodity which determined many other aspects of the route? How heavy was it? Could you move it by land or only by sea? What sort of intermediate processing was found along the routes? What about the movement of books, scrolls, artwork, relics? Particularly think of, again, the northern and southern Silk Roads, on which Buddhist relics, icons, monks, teachers, students traveled regularly. And last, networks. What networks routinely used the route? Government bureaucrats, ship captains, caravan leaders, itinerant preachers, skilled tradesmen, gypsies, poets, philosophers. How was reputation established along the route? How did reputation translate into actions of trust among social networks? Might consider the Nile in this. It's one of the places that we have the clearest evidence of networks that ran all the way upriver and downriver, of Copts, of Turks, and of Arabs, and ultimately of English. How did networks manage risk? I want to take one route and subject it to this sort of analysis. Let's see if I can get it here. This is the great Inca route, which is going to be one in the book. You can see it runs on the foothills of both sides of the Andes, all the way from north to south, and tied the empire together. Yep. Lost it again. Okay, let me talk a bit about this route. You can see that the feeder lines run from interior east coast of Africa. It runs north to the island of Socotra, from there to the island of Mawassa, from there inland and up to Baghdad. It also has a second route that goes this way, which I'll talk about in a minute. It also goes on to India. The route has great historical depth. Slaves were mentioned as a trade item in this coast in the Roman period. A Greek ship captain wrote a guide known as the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea that describes the slave trade along this route. It lasted nearly 2,000 years as a slave route. The long-distance transport of slaves had to be carefully planned so that ships had enough food and water. The coast, especially of the Horn of Africa, has absolutely nothing to offer, and a becalmed ship was probably going to starve. The Periplus got the ecological necessities of the route absolutely right. The yearly pattern of winds dictated the slave transport from the East African coast was only possible in the summer months, where the winds are moving this direction. Ideally arriving around September. By December, the winds have reversed, and ships would return to the East African coast. The island of Socotra, which I mentioned, is crucial in the route. It also was one where pirates from the west coast of India routinely came to sell goods. Institutional forms. There are various governments along the East African coast. All were deeply involved in the slave trade. Kilwa, Mogadishu, Mombasa, later Zanzibar Island. They derived most of their income from the trade, and the governments themselves provided guards for slave columns and built holding facilities. I'm following Mark Horton's work on the Swahili, masterful piece that it is. He works out the history that the development of the slave trading culture along the east coast of Africa happened in stages. First, there were fishing villages along the coast. Arab sailors contacted them to trade, and everyone realized that the main item would be slaves. Soon these fishermen began organizing raids on inland tribes and capturing slaves. In the process, everyone had to agree on when the Arab traders would show up and some kind of reasonable price for the slaves. This was done quite straight away. There were shared mental expectations that the trade would be ongoing and profitable and predictable enough that it would be a source of revenue and livelihood. Actually, the Arab sea traders brought the necessary items for slaving, shackles and weapons. Slowly, the local groups became richer from the slave trade and developed a lifestyle much different from other local fishermen. It included cities, houses with distinct architecture, conversion to Islam, mosques, luxury goods such as Chinese porcelain, distinctive dress based on Indian cottons, especially from Gujarat. These changes signaled an affinity with Arab and Islamic practices of the long-distance traders that they dealt with. And interestingly, in hinterland relationships, well, Muslims are forbidden to enslave other Muslims, so there was very good reason the Swahili prevented inland tribes from converting to Islam. By the 14th century, Ibn Battuta, the most widely traveled man of the Middle Ages, observed that the coast was fully Muslim and court ritual was much like that of the Middle East at the time. At Mogadishu, the Sultan presented Ibn Battuta with a truly international set of clothes. Quote, "On the fourth day, which was Friday, the Qadi and the students of the Sheikh's viziers came to me, bringing me a set of robes. These robes of theirs consist of a silk wrapper, which one ties around the waist, a tunic of Egyptian linen with an embroidered border, a furred mantle of Jerusalem stuff, which was probably wool and certainly wouldn't have been very suitable for the climate, and an Egyptian turban with an embroidered edge." Ibn Battuta's observations suggest the full integration of the Swahili coast into an elite material culture that at the time stretched from Spain to India. Material flows. When the slaves left the East African coast, they entered a much larger, institutionalized trading world. Fragmentary evidence from the 16th century, both indigenous and Portuguese, suggests that the slave transport was quite specialized. Slaves were not, by and large, shipped as part of the cargo of a mixed commodity transport ship. There were extra guards and precautions for transporting slaves. If we follow the slaves north, they first would have come to the island of Socotra. The ships took on water and food, and not only did it have a slave market and holding compounds, the slave market was for ongoing, in some cases, the slaves were simply directly shipped to India from here. The next stop would likely have been Aden, near the mouth of the Red Sea, with jails, guards, markets, and buyers. The demand was regular enough that prices, for example, remained relatively stable for the entire 16th century. At Aden, the stream of slaves from East Africa joined two others, one from highland Ethiopia and one the plains of current-day Somalia. Christian highland Ethiopia was, at least from the 11th century onwards, a full slave-dependent society. Slaves did all the manual labor. The government collected taxes from its western conquests in slaves. Wars, particularly against lowland Muslim states, also produced slaves, and the government's main source of income was from the purchase and resale of slaves from the interior tribes. So highland Ethiopia is right here. Routinely, government troops went into the interior from there, collected caravans, often 3,000 or more, and brought them down to the islands of Mawassa, which is right there. Mawassa consisted of a set of small islands just off the western coast of the Red Sea. Yeah. Actually, here. I'm sorry, Mawassa is right there. And they provided shelter against storms. It was the only port in 500 miles of coastline. The Portuguese found that it had 49 water cisterns, large ones, that stored rainwater, but the island's food supply came from the mainland. The population of Mawassa was about 3,000, according to the Portuguese sources, though several observers noted that the population doubled with the arrival of a big slave caravan. The third stream of slaves came from the eastern states and here, both fighting other tribes and going inland, picking up slaves and bringing them out to the coast. Just as there were three streams of slaves that coalesced at Aden, there were three roads to Baghdad, all portions of the great East African route. The first headed inland from Mocha to the city of Zabid, or Zabid, I'm not sure, right here, on the coastal plains of Yemen. I have to remember that Yemen was much more heavily watered at the time and has since desiccated considerably. Ibn Battuta visited Zabid in 1330. He loved the place. There's no place in all Al-Yemen that is larger nor whose population is wealthier. It lies amidst luxuriant gardens with many streams and fruits such as bananas and others. Its inhabitants are courteous in manners, upright in conduct, handsome in figure, and its women are of exceeding and preeminent beauty. He does not mention the slave trade, which was the entire basis of the town's prosperity. On this first route, slaves left Zabid on a road that led northeast across the desert to Bahrain, up the Persian Gulf, and up the Euphrates River to Baghdad. A second route took the slaves by sea east to Kish, which is right here, Kish, up there, and again up to Baghdad. There was another route which was more common than I expected, a simple, brutal overland march to Baghdad. It's hard to imagine that women and children would have made that route. It's dry, it's rough, it's very hot, and almost nothing on it. The caravan would have been bound for Baghdad and the slave market and domestic service in any of 100 cities and towns in the Middle East. Finally, networks. We actually know precious little about the networks of the professionals who maintained the East African trade. We had the periplus, and centuries, millennia later, pilots, we have a text where pilots memorized the navigation of the route in the form of sung poems. Here in translation is a verb from the coast, a verse from the coast below Mogadishu, down there. He refers to Akrab, which is a star that matched up with the correct compass roads reading. Akrab is now your star, follow it. Wherever it goes, accompaniment. It covers all the Banadir coast, which is along as far as Barawa. After that lies safety. The route thrived until concerted effort by the British Navy disrupted it in the late 19th and early 20th century. The legacy of the route continues in ethnic and coastal versus inland politics in all of the East African coastal nations, from Tanzania north to Somalia. Okay. Some stuff that's come out of the research already. At the very least, I hope I've complicated how you think about routes, and you'll at least pause when you see the term trade route. You might question notions of supply and demand as pretty unsubtle. You might find Abu Lagad's ideas of circulation a bit simple-minded. Here's some thoughts that have come out of this comparative perspective. One, there is a meta-history of the route itself, which is considerably more complicated than one might think. It's not a simple rise, high period, and fall. Rather, for example, there can be an extremely long period of active use, like the Nile or the Grand Canal of China, interrupted only by rebellions and dynasty changes. There can be various periods of importance interspersed by relatively long periods of unimportance. The Roman Appian Way, for example, is just this light. It's important early and it's important late, but because it was a perimeter road and the perimeter moved north towards Bulgaria, it became relatively unimportant in the middle years of the empire. Some routes remain single purpose for very long periods, such as the Hajj or the Compostela pilgrimage. Some routes were so highly dependent on government for the institutional forms that supported them that they went immediately into decline with the disruption of government for any of the usual reasons: rebellion, invasion, drought, the basic incompetence or corruption. We might put the Appian Way in this basket, also the Grand Canal, the Inca Road, even the El Camino Real, and the Nile. Other routes were, in contrast, less dependent on a single government for institutional support. In this category, we might put the Southeast Asian spice route, the East African slave trade. In these, governments usually only controlled the port, not the intervening ocean. Along the Great Iroquois route, which I didn't mention, but actually runs through where we are and will be one of the ones I work on in North America, it goes from Albany to Buffalo, through the Great Lakes, to Detroit, and then through what's now US 12 to Chicago. And that went through often hostile and competing Indian tribes that sometimes got along and sometimes they could do the whole route. The relation of technology to the long-term history of routes is very complex. Many became a successful route only after the invention of a particular technology. An example of this is the long-distance trade in Southeast Asia. It puttered along until the invention of the compass, in which case it took off. And by the year 1000, even fairly low-level ships had compasses and could negotiate the long-distance trade between the Southeast Asian islands and India. Similarly, on the Mississippi, it became a successful route for large-scale commodity only after the invention of the flatboat. The reason for the flatboat is that the Mississippi drops to levels of maybe only 4 feet of clearance to the bottom, and that's about as low as it goes. Below that, you're not going to be traveling on it at all, but it doesn't happen very often. And they managed to build a flatboat that could carry a substantial cargo and had only a draft of 4 feet. The Inca Road, up and down through South America, depended on bridge building technology to cross huge gorges. The transport on the Nile that was successful required shallow draft sailing vessels that could use both sails and oars. Some seasons of the year you get very steady winds coming from the north, which are great for getting upstream, but only a particular kind of boat could take care of that, and they invented it and was in use for a very long time. As I said, some routes show remarkable resilience in the face of technological change. Over the course of 2 centuries, the Iroquois Trail became the Erie Canal, which became Interstate 90. Other routes, of course, show no technological change. 12th century pilgrims walked to Compostela, and they still do. The basic caravan on the Silk Road changed little between Fa Hien in the 2nd century and Orelstein in the 20th century. Some of the most fascinating for me aspects of a route are the mental ones. It seems clear that much was created along the route. It's not a function of a civilization at each end. In contrast, cuisine, shrines, fashion, relics, language, ideas are in fact fabricated, traded, worked on, and developed on the route itself. Commodities and goods were processed and reprocessed all along the way. They created new forms which are not pale reflections of civilizations at each end, but are in fact new attempts using both traditional and very innovative practices. Sometimes, as we've seen with the Swahili, virtually a whole new culture was created in the process of developing a route. One of the curious features is that the route culture, as it develops, often outlives the route itself. Think about the songs of the Erie Canal or the Mississippi River, which are still played and sung. The route on which they were developed, in the case of the Erie Canal, is largely gone. Another curious feature is the way sacred routes, and this has been talked about in the pilgrimage literature, create a specialized time that conflates the now with the sacred events that the pilgrimage is to experience. And the route itself becomes a kind of time warp or time machine by which people who are walking on it, or both to the Hajj and Compostela for sure, experience being in an earlier time. I find this curious and interesting. I also find interesting political uses of routes. For example, China, the government of China has been absolutely central in the revival of Silk Road studies. There are very good reasons for this. They have Western irredentists' claims, and for them to promote Silk Road studies and the recovery of the Silk Road supports those irredentist claims. Similar pattern in California in the early 20th century. El Camino Real had pretty much been completely forgotten. A group of booster women decided that this was important for the image of California and started lobbying the state legislature to mark and celebrate El Camino Real, and it has become not just an imagined route, which it was for them, but in fact a route again, marked, shown, and celebrated in travel literature. I find it curious the way a mental imagining results in the revival of a physical place. The Appian Way has emerged as a hiking route from Rome to Brindisi in Italy, celebrated, noted, signed with signage. The Nile has reemerged as a tourist destination. Boats that claim to be traditional now take tourists up the Nile to Luxor and do not carry any of the previous traffic in goods, in heavy goods, that they used to. One more, perhaps, is the relation of the route to its surrounding hinterland. This, again, is very complex, very interesting. Trade does not always make people wealthy. Braudel, to the contrary, natural trade between two areas that do different things does not result necessarily in wealth for both of them. On the Mississippi, the early trading by Native Americans in the Arkansas area started within 30 years. It had decimated the buffalo, decimated the bear, and made the group entirely dependent on cloth, iron, and weapons from the Europeans. Within another generation, they had lost all the skills to make weapons and cloth themselves. Because the buffalo and the bear were the only thing that they could really trade, they became poorer and poorer, eventually decimated by smallpox. And by the 19th century, they had started at about 5,000 to 6,000, this particular group I'm looking at, and they were down to less than 1,000 people. The hinterland relations abruptly change when agriculture is introduced into the Mississippi Valley in the 18th and 19th century. Both sides in the Civil War acutely understood that the route was key to control of the hinterland, and both sides tried to control the Mississippi River. However, this relation between hinterland and route gets more and more complicated as you look at different routes. Rome pushed the Appian Egnatian Way through a sullen, hostile Greece. The attempt to introduce Roman estates, legion cities, and Latin basically failed. In contrast, the Grand Canal of China, with an enormous investment of bureaucrats and soldiers and the recruitment of corvée labor, basically succeeded in tying the North and the productive South together. The East African route, as we've seen, was hostile and exploitive of its more distant hinterland, but supportive of its immediate hinterland, since the Swahili needed food. But perhaps most interesting of all is the unintended products of a route. They were not intended by any government. First and foremost might be the movement of people and peoples and ethnic mixing. There was a movement by Bulgarians and Romanian people south into Greece and west along the Appian Way. Similarly, there's the flow of Native American wives from French fur traders into French settlements along the Mississippi. I'm working with DNA mapping studies to try and document some of the movement of these people along the routes I've selected. There's also the unrecorded and virtually unnoticed movement of plants into new places. Sugarcane into the Nile Valley, the banana into Africa. And last but not least, disease, which sure we think of as Black Death coming down the west end of the Silk Road into the Middle East and Europe. But there's also disease that came right up and down the Nile, killing animals and humans. Rift Valley fever is what it was called. There was smallpox all up and down the Mississippi. I hope this book, Roots, changes our thinking about world or connected history. Rather than a focus on individual regions, civilizations, oceans, the book makes the route itself, what it carried, how it operated, the consequences, the hinterland, central. The route was not only about trade. All the other things that the route carried were equally important. Ideas, armies, brides, religions, fashion, ceremonies, all of them were central, necessary. They were vital parts of the structure and process of the route. I don't think it's possible to discuss commodity circulation without them. We need to understand the route as a combination of physical terrain, institutional support, entrepreneurial and productive activity, and complex mental expectations. At a more general level, a comparison of historical roots allows analysis of common human problems, for example, uneven distribution of resources, geographic barriers, yearly weather patterns, how to keep control of productive land, and how to make sense, cosmic sense of a capricious world. The focus on roots allows both for independent arriving of similar ideas, but also allows us to view culture that has moved, shifted, and modified to meet local conditions. To this point, the material and the perspective is exciting enough that I sit down to a day's writing with a smile, and I can't ask for more than that. Thank you.